I'm not great at getting stuff out of my head, so I'm just sitting here in my living room, trying to tell this as best I can. My name doesn't matter, and I'm not saying where I worked. Not exactly, but you'll probably figure it out. Let's just say that I spent years as a border agent on a stretch of the southern border that most people don't think about. Sort of a remote place. Anyway, before every patrol, we'd get these safety briefings. Most of it was the usual reminders. Check your gear, stay hydrated, don't wander off alone. But one time, the supervisor tossed out this line like it was meant to lighten the mood. If you ever see something out there you can't explain, just pretend you didn't. Everybody chuckled, but the room felt off for a second. The kind of pause where you realize people are laughing because they don't know what else to do. I remember catching this quick look from one of the guys across the table, just a flick of the eyes, like he was checking if I'd heard it the same way he did. It was like we all understood something without saying it, even though I couldn't have told you what that something was. I didn't think about it again for months. And then one night, out on patrol, those words came back to me so suddenly, it felt like someone whispered it in the truck. It's because of what I saw. I remember pulling the truck over near one of the access roads to check on a sensor that had been acting up earlier in the week. Not a big deal. Half our equipment had quirks. Some of the guys joked we spent more time babysitting electronics than anything else. I wasn't expecting trouble. I wasn't expecting anything, really. What still throws me is that I didn't get that usual something's off feeling. No hairs standing up, no gut instinct, just this weird quiet. I only noticed because it made the truck's cooling fan sound louder than it should have. I got out, stretched my legs, and walked the couple of yards to the sensor housing. I'd done it 100 times, but as soon as I crouched down, my radio clicked. Just a tiny tap of static, like someone pressed the button and let go. Nobody said anything. No call sign, no chatter. Just that single little click. You hear that sometimes when another unit is testing their mic or brushing it against a vest. Usually someone follows it up with, sorry, accidental, or at least some breathing in the background. But this time it was only silence. And that's when the supervisor's joke came back in my mind again. Stronger. Not the words, just the feeling behind them. I didn't know why yet. I just remember standing up, looking around at a whole lot of nothing, and thinking for the first time that night, maybe I should hurry this up. So there I was, packing up my tools when dispatch chimed in. Just this quick alert saying a motion sensor a few miles out had tripped, but the timing got my attention. It was one of the older sensors, the kind that barely works unless you kick it, and it hadn't reported anything in weeks. What really stuck with me, though, was the pattern the alert showed. It wasn't one clean trigger like something passing by. It pulsed 3 times, evenly spaced, almost like footsteps, but way too heavy for a person, and too slow for an animal running. I didn't tell dispatch that. I just said I'd check it out and started driving. On the way over, I kept thinking about how the older guys used to joke about things walking wrong out there. They'd never explain it. They'd just shake their heads and say, "You'll know it if you ever see it." But while I drove, I caught myself remembering something I'd never thought about again until that moment. How one of them once mentioned seeing shoulders higher than they should have been. He said it moved like it was learning. I figured he was messing with me. I shouldn't admit this, but as I got closer to the sensor location, I caught myself watching the dirt road ahead, like I expected to see those 2 high shoulders crossing it. Or maybe something else they used to mention, eyes that didn't shine back when you hit them with a flashlight, not glowing, just absorbing the light instead of reflecting it. I told myself it was just stories, just nerves. But the closer I got, the more I got that strange pressure behind my jaw, the kind you get before a bad storm. No reason for it, no change in weather, just that pressure. I pulled up to the sensor spot, and the first thing I noticed was that the brush along the fence line looked disturbed, not trampled, not pushed aside, more like something tall had slid through it without bending anything the right way. I stepped out of the truck, and the first thing I noticed was the air. It felt heavier, like I'd walked into a room where someone had just been arguing. I did a quick sweep with my flashlight. Nothing. But then the beam landed on the dirt near the sensor post, and I froze. There were marks, not prints, just long, shallow impressions like something had pressed down with more weight than it meant to. They were spaced apart too far for a person, too straight for an animal, and the ground around them wasn't disturbed, like whatever made them didn't shift its weight normally. I wanted to call it in. My hand even went to the radio, but something stopped me. Not fear, more like I didn't want to explain what I was looking at because I didn't even have words for it. Before I could think it through, the radio crackled again. One sharp burst, then nothing. The silence after was so complete that I actually heard my own pulse in my ears. I remember telling myself, just get back in the truck. Simple. Easy. But I didn't. I kept scanning the fence line because something in me felt watched. That pressure behind my jaw came back, stronger, the kind you get before a nosebleed. And then I heard it, slow, deliberate, like someone adjusting their stance. My flashlight went straight toward the noise, and for half a second I caught movement. It slid behind a mesquite tree. I say slid because its shape didn't match the way it moved. It was upright, but too smooth, like it didn't have joints where it should have. I took one step forward without meaning to. My brain was trying to tell me it was a person, had to be. But the height was off, the shoulders were too narrow, and it didn't make the sounds a person makes when they shift their weight in dirt or brush. No crunch, no snap, nothing. Just that quiet sliding. I called out, not a full call, just a quick, hey, to gauge distance. The sound died faster than it should have, like the air swallowed it. Then something changed. Whatever was behind that tree leaned out just enough for me to see part of its head. Not the whole face, just the angle where an eye should have been. And that's when everything in me locked up, because the eye didn't shine. It didn't catch the light. It just stayed dark, like the beam disappeared into it. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I don't think I could have. The thing tilted its head in this slow, uneven way, like it was trying to match my shape, trying to understand what I was. Then, just like before, it slipped back out of view, not running, not hiding, moving like it knew exactly how close it could get without me stopping it. That was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with a person. I don't know what made me step closer. Maybe it was training. Maybe I just didn't want to admit I was scared. But I moved, slow, trying to get an angle around the mesquite tree, and that's when it stepped back out, not charging, not sneaking. It stepped out the way a person would, except everything about the movement was wrong. Each part of its body seemed to move on its own delay, like it was copying a motion it had only seen once. The first thing I noticed was the height. It wasn't huge, maybe a little over 6 feet. But it felt taller because it held its shoulders too high, almost up toward its neck, like it didn't know where they were supposed to rest. Its limbs were long, but not in a cartoonish way, more like it had grown a little too fast and hadn't figured out how to use them yet. The arms hung low and the elbows seemed set a little farther down than normal, just enough that my brain flagged it before I fully understood why. The skin, that's what still gets to me. It wasn't pale and it wasn't dark. It was the color of dust, like dried mud or clay, but smooth, almost too smooth, like it didn't have pores. The flashlight didn't bounce off it the way it should have. It dulled the light, soaked it in, like the skin ate the brightness instead of reflecting it. And its face, wow, just wow. It had a face shaped like a person's, but stretched in places where it shouldn't be. The jaw was narrow, almost too narrow, and the cheekbones were set a bit too high. Not enough to scream monster, just enough to unsettle you the longer you looked. But the eyes were the worst. They were perfectly round, larger than normal, and completely matte. No shine, no reflection, no white. Just dark, uniform circles that didn't blink. Not once. I kept waiting for that tiny twitch of a lid, that little sign of a living thing, and it never came. It watched me with this stillness that felt practiced, like it wasn't looking at me but through me, studying what I'd do next. Then it moved its head, slow and deliberate, like it was mimicking curiosity. Its mouth opened a little, not wide, not like a threat, just enough to show that it didn't have teeth the way we do. I saw shapes in there, rounded, smoothed down structures, not meant for biting, more like grinding. While I stood there frozen, it lifted one arm. The motion was stiff, almost robotic. It brought its hand, long fingers, too many knuckles, to its chest and pressed lightly, like it was checking for something or imitating a gesture it had seen before. And that's when I realized something that made my stomach drop. It wasn't afraid of me, because it didn't recognize me as anything dangerous. It didn't even recognize me as something like itself. It was just cataloging me. We stared at each other, me shaking, it completely still, for what felt like a minute. Then, with no warning, it turned. The whole body rotated before the head followed, like it forgot how joints work, and it slipped back into the brush, silent, leaving those impossible impressions in the dirt. I didn't move until I couldn't hear it anymore, and even then, I wasn't sure if I could move at all. But I finally got myself back to the truck. I don't remember walking. I just remember slamming the door and sitting there with both hands locked around the wheel, trying to convince myself I'd misread what I saw. People don't move like that. Nothing moves like that. I radioed in that the sensor was clear. I didn't mention the impressions in the dirt. I didn't mention the thing in the brush. I figured if I said it out loud, it would become real in a way I wasn't ready for. Backup showed up 20 minutes later. 2 agents I'd worked with for years. They walked the area, flashlight beams sweeping the ground. Nothing. Not one mark, not one broken branch. Like the dirt had smoothed itself out. One of them asked, too casually, "Did you actually see anything?" Not what I saw, not who, just anything. The way he said it made my skin crawl, like he already knew the answer he wanted. I just said, "Sensors glitching again." He nodded way too fast. A few days later, I asked about the sensor logs, just out of curiosity, or at least that's what I told myself. The tech guy shrugged and said the file corrupted right after the alert. No backup, no timestamps. Happens with the older units, he said, except that sensor wasn't old enough for that to make sense. I dropped it, or I tried to. But the next week, I caught one of the senior agents watching me a little too long during roll call. Not angry, not suspicious, more like he was waiting to see if I'd say something. When our eyes met, he looked away, fast, like he'd been caught doing something he wasn't supposed to. After that, I started noticing small things. Radios cutting out in the same dead pockets. Footprints, if you can call them that, near spots where no patrols were scheduled. Dead quiet in places that used to buzz with crickets and coyotes. And the worst part? None of the others ever said a word about it. Not even the ones who definitely saw the same things I did. It was like we'd all silently agreed to pretend nothing was out there. I don't know what I saw. I don't know where it came from. I don't know if it was something natural we just don't have a name for, or something made by people who don't want their names on anything. All I know is that the more I think about how smoothly it moved, how it watched me like I was a problem to solve, the less convinced I am that I caught it by accident. Maybe I wasn't the one doing the observing that night. Maybe I was the test. Every October, a group of dedicated birdwatchers gathered in Salt Fork State Park in Ohio. The group had been getting together for years, Initially, just a few strangers with binoculars, but gradually becoming good friends. Some drove from Cleveland or Columbus. A couple even came up from Cincinnati every year. For them, the fall migration season in Salt Fork was the highlight of the year, and they'd start planning as soon as summer rolled around. The park had this almost mystical quality, with trails snaking through thick woods, hilly paths, and valleys full of hidden ponds. Plus, it was one of the best spots in Ohio to see rare birds that only appeared as they headed south for the winter. This particular weekend was supposed to be perfect. Cool, but not cold, sunny, and with good weather for spotting the last flocks before winter truly hit. There were 6 of them this time, including Luke, a retired middle school teacher who organized the trip, and Millie, a quiet woman in her 40s who never said much, but seemed to spot every bird within 100 yards. They met at the picnic area, catching up and talking about what they hoped to see this time. Owen, the youngest in the group, excitedly shared he'd heard a rumor about a rare owl sighting in the area, and his enthusiasm rubbed off on everyone. By noon, they were deep into the woods, following a trail that led to a small clearing where they could wait and watch for birds. The group settled in the clearing, quieting down, adjusting their binoculars, and glancing up now and then whenever a sound rustled in the trees. The woods around them felt peaceful, even cozy. For an hour or so, they had some good sightings: a red-tailed hawk, a few woodpeckers, even a bald eagle in the distance. Luke was telling a story about a long-tailed duck he'd seen back in '94, when Millie put up her hand to hush him. She'd spotted something moving on the ridge just above the clearing, something large and oddly silent. They all turned to look, expecting maybe a deer or, if they were lucky, a coyote. But what they saw made them all freeze. It was tall, standing maybe 7 or 8 feet, with long, thick hair covering its body. The hair wasn't uniform, though. It was clumpy, and patches of skin peeked through. The figure was only partially visible through the trees, but it was enough to make everyone's breath catch. They could see it walking on 2 legs, shifting awkwardly, but with purpose. It had a slouched, almost hunched posture, and its arms were long, swinging in a way that seemed unnatural, but eerily intentional. Luke was the first to react, a short, almost involuntary laugh escaping his lips. "Well, that's something," he whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. The rest of the group stayed silent, their eyes fixed on the figure. Owen, who was usually the bravest of them, took a few steps back and nudged Luke, his face pale. "Are we seeing what I think we're seeing?" he whispered. He sounded younger than usual, almost like a kid asking for reassurance. Millie, clutching her binoculars like they were a lifeline, kept her gaze steady. She wasn't as easily shaken as the rest of them, but even she looked rattled. "I think so," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She glanced at Luke, then back at the figure, as if waiting for someone to say something that made sense. But nobody did. They all just stood there, watching this thing. A creature, really, though none of them wanted to call it that yet, moving slowly along the ridge. It didn't seem to notice them, or maybe it did and didn't care. Either way, its gaze stayed forward, focused on some invisible path deeper into the woods. Luke's rational mind kicked in after a few moments. "It's probably just some hiker or something," he whispered, though even he didn't sound convinced. He didn't know why anyone would be dressed like that in the woods, especially this deep in the park, but he clung to the idea. Halloween's coming up, so who knows, he thought. Owen shook his head, his eyes wide. "I've been hiking out here for years, and I've never seen anyone like that. That's not a costume, Luke." The thing on the ridge paused, and for a second they thought it was going to turn toward them. Everyone held their breath, tense, waiting. Millie, oddly enough, seemed the calmest of the group. She kept watching, her face expressionless, almost curious. Then, just as quietly as it had come, the figure moved along, disappearing behind the trees and leaving only the crackling of leaves in its wake. They stood there in silence, each processing what they'd seen in their own way. Luke tried to joke, saying, "Well, we got more than we bargained for on this trip, huh?" But nobody laughed. Millie looked at him, her expression unreadable, and shrugged. "There's more out there than we think," she said quietly, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. It was the longest sentence any of them had ever heard her say in all the time they'd known her. As they started to head back to the parking lot, everyone's nerves were shot. Owen walked quickly, his eyes darting around every time he heard a twig snap. Even Luke, usually the leader, stuck close to the group. Millie, however, seemed almost unaffected, like she'd just seen a common bird and moved on. When they finally made it back to the lot, they all stood around awkwardly, not really knowing what to say. Luke tried to lighten the mood, suggesting they head into town and grab a drink. Everyone agreed, desperate for something normal. Over beers, they rehashed the experience, everyone adding details, trying to make sense of it. They debated what it could have been: a prankster, an escaped animal, some local legend. Millie, of course, was the only one who didn't speculate. She sat there quietly, listening, her eyes distant. When Owen finally asked her what she thought it was, she just shrugged again. "Sometimes you don't have to know everything. Just let it be," she said. The conversation shifted, with everyone getting caught up in other topics, but nobody could fully shake what they'd seen. Even when they were laughing and talking, there was an unspoken heaviness in the air. They'd come looking for birds, but they'd left with something much more memorable. And as for Millie, she never mentioned it again, not once, though every year she kept coming back to Salt Fork, binoculars around her neck, eyes scanning the ridges, but secretly hoping to see nothing. What would you do? Would you want to see it again? I hated being the wife of a truck driver, gone most days and not much time to wander off together. But the few times I got to go on the road with him made up for most of it, especially the one time when I got to see the mountains of Colorado and the big sky of Montana. Unfortunately, not every trip was the fun, beautiful vacation I had hoped for, and this story is about one of those not-so-vacation-y trips. I had finally convinced my husband to take me on the road again. It had been a few months, and I was getting cabin fever. It was hard being stuck in one place for very long, so I was excited when he pulled into town and told me we were headed north to Minnesota. I packed quickly and threw my small suitcase onto the bunk, and we set off. I was literally like a kid in a candy shop, with excitement. It was late autumn. The trees that raced by the windows were changing colors, which made the trip even more interesting. I loved that time of year. We made it to Minnesota and completed his delivery, which meant that the next few days would be downtime and we could Uber around and explore the area. At least that's what we planned. We woke up the next morning to over 2 feet of snow. Even though the snow was going to interfere with us exploring, there was snow, which was an added layer of fun. We stayed in the truck that day, laughing and watching TV. But with more snow on the way, it was clear we were going to be in Minnesota longer than we had planned. My husband's company sent out an email to their drivers up north and let them know that they were going to be getting them all hotel rooms. I took that in stride too. To be honest, I was ready for a hot bath and hot food. We cleaned up the truck and headed to the hotel. This part of Minnesota was so beautiful. I had never been to the Great Lakes, and being this close was definitely breathtaking. The snow just added to it. We made it to the hotel and quickly ran inside, getting everything moved in so that we could request a ride to get dinner. After waiting about an hour, our Uber arrived. Thankfully, he was in a big SUV and knew how to drive in the snow. We asked the driver if he knew of any places we should be sure to check out while we were up there, and he let us know about the Superior National Forest. I was immediately intrigued and wanted to go see this forest. The driver offered to let us adjust our trip and take us through a few of the roads up there. We eagerly agreed, and I made the needed adjustments on the app. I wouldn't have been as excited if I had known about the horror we were about to encounter. As we pulled into the forest, I was immediately impressed with the size of the trees. We pulled over and the driver started telling us about the legends up in this area while I snapped a few pictures on my phone. Dark was quickly approaching and some of the shots I got were coming out blurry. I cleaned my camera lens and tried again, but immediately I screamed. When I was looking at my phone, I could see red eyes, but when I looked up, I didn't see them. Not at first. I slapped my husband's knee and pointed in the direction of the eyes. At first, he was annoyed because he couldn't see what I was seeing, but as he leaned over me and looked up, he sucked in his breath fast and hard. In the image was a creature that was easily 10 feet tall, but that wasn't all of it. It was crazy skinny, with long fangs and an insanely long tongue that hung out of its mouth. I watched in awe as this creature stalked closer toward us. As it got closer, I could see that it was covered in matted fur, and its eyes glowed brighter. I started to panic and screamed for the driver to go. He was completely oblivious to the creature coming up on us, but responded to the fear in my voice. Looking around frantically, he threw the SUV into gear and peeled out in the snow, burying the wheel and leaving us stuck. I frantically started looking for any kind of weapon to defend us, even though I know how stupid that sounds now. I was so scared, and my husband was racking his brain trying to figure out what to do to help. The driver was silent, trying to rock the car and get us free from the creature. It was right on top of us now. All I could see was its dirty, matted skin. The stink that it was putting off was making me gag. It smelled of rotten, decaying flesh. It was horrible. I covered my mouth and shook my head. I remember sitting there for what felt like decades as this creature stood over the car. I was shaking. The rotting flesh stench was making my stomach turn, and I was so thankful there was nothing in my stomach. The driver of our Uber had given up on trying to get us free. I think we all realized our best bet was to stay as silent and as still as possible. Of course, that was definitely easier said than done, especially when the thing slammed against the passenger side of the SUV. I motioned to the driver to be ready. If it did it again, we could use the rocking to get out of there. Sure enough, the thing slammed into us again, harder this time. The driver was a quick learner. As soon as the SUV rocked back down onto fresh snow, he slammed the gas, and we shot out of there. When we got back to town, we were all still freaking out. We told the driver that we had lost any interest in eating and requested that he take us back to our room. With no surprise at all, he agreed and let us go with no charge. That night has stuck with me like a virus you can't shake. Needless to say, I will never venture into the woods in Minnesota again. My husband agrees, and it's a promise we've made to each other. Stay safe, everyone. Growing up in rural Colorado, my life was about as typical as it gets for a kid raised on a cattle ranch. My parents owned a decent-sized spread just outside of a small town called Silver Cliff, and from the time I could walk, I was out there helping with chores. I wasn't the kind of kid who dreamed about city life or college. I was content with the rhythm of ranch life, the early mornings, the hard work, and the sense of pride that came with being part of something that mattered. I knew I'd be taking over the family business one day, and that was fine by me. One summer when I was around 17, my dad decided to send me off to help out at a neighboring ranch about 50 miles north. The old man who ran it, Mr. Harlan, had broken his leg and was having a hard time keeping up with everything. My dad figured it would be a good opportunity for me to learn a few new tricks and get some experience working for someone else. I wasn't exactly thrilled about leaving home, but I respected Mr. Harlan, and I knew he could use the help. Mr. Harlan's place was different from ours. For one, it was a lot bigger. He had more land, more cattle, and more horses. But what really set it apart was how isolated it was. The ranch sat at the edge of a dense forest, miles away from the nearest neighbor. It was beautiful in a rugged sort of way, but there was something about that forest that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Mr. Harlan warned me right off the bat not to go wandering into the woods, especially after dark. He said it was easy to get lost, and folks around those parts had a way of sticking to the trails. The first couple of weeks were uneventful. I spent most of my time mending fences, rounding up cattle, and doing the usual ranch work. Mr. Harlan was grateful for the help, and I could tell he was impressed with my work ethic. Everything was going smoothly until one evening when I had to go check on some cattle that had wandered close to the tree line. It was just before sunset, and the sky was a deep orange, fading into purple as I rode out on my horse, Blue. I found the cattle grazing peacefully, but I noticed a few of them seemed skittish, their heads darting towards the forest. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to them being wary of predators, but something about the way they were acting didn't sit right with me. As I was herding them back toward the open pasture, I heard something, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down my spine. Blue froze, his ears perked up, and he let out a nervous snort. I turned in the saddle, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but all I could see were the darkening shadows of the trees. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the tree line, something was moving. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but as it stepped out of the shadows, I realized it was something else entirely. It stood on two legs like a man, but it was covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes glowed in the dim light, and its mouth was filled with sharp teeth that gleamed as it snarled. I've seen plenty of predators in my time, wolves, mountain lions, even a grizzly once, but nothing like this. Blue was getting more and more restless, and I knew if I didn't act fast, we'd both be in trouble. I tried to nudge Blue into motion, but before I could get him to move, the creature let out a bone-chilling howl. It was a sound I'll never forget. Part animal, part human, and all wrong. The cattle bolted, scattering in every direction, and Blue reared up in fear, nearly throwing me off. I barely managed to hang on as Blue took off at a full gallop, heading back toward the ranch. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind us, getting closer and closer. My only thought was to get out of there, to reach the safety of the ranch house and hope that whatever was chasing us would give up. By the time we reached the barn, Blue was breathing heavily, and I was shaking so badly I could hardly dismount. I stumbled into the barn, slamming the door behind me and barring it with a heavy wooden plank. I could barely catch my breath. I could hear something outside, pacing around the barn, but it didn't try to break in. Thank goodness for small miracles. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds outside faded, and everything went quiet. I stayed in the barn for a while longer, too scared to move. When I finally did step outside, the sun had set, and the only light came from the stars. I didn't see any sign of the creature, but I swear I could feel it watching me from the shadows. The next morning, I told Mr. Harlan what had happened. He didn't say much, just nodded and told me to stay close to the ranch house for the rest of my stay. He didn't seem surprised, but he didn't offer any explanations either. Over the next few days, I noticed he became more cautious, always keeping a rifle within reach and making sure all the animals were locked up tight at night. I never saw the creature again, but the memory of that night stayed with me. After I returned home, I did some digging, asking around about the woods near Meister Harlan's ranch. Most folks didn't want to talk about it, but I did hear a few stories, tales of strange sightings and eerie howls in the night. Some people called it a dog man, a creature that was half man, half wolf, and known for stalking the deep woods of the Rockies. I don't know what I saw that night, but I do know this. There's something out there, something that doesn't belong in the world as we know it. It's wild, it's dangerous, and it's smart enough to stay hidden from most folks. If you ever find yourself in the woods at night and you hear something that doesn't sound quite right, do yourself a favor, turn around and get out of there as fast as you can. There are things out there you don't want to meet. And trust me, you'll be better off if you never do.